Thank you for your opening statements. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule for questions, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Many Americans are taught in civics class that Congress passes a law and that's it. But the reality is that major legislation enacted by Congress that addresses climate change, workers' rights, health care, must also be implemented and enforced by the executive branch to become a reality. To do that, federal agencies go through a process of administrative rulemaking or the creation of regulation that enforces the law. Unfortunately, this has turned into a shadowy process where special interests and big corporations send a bevy of lobbyists to make sure that the rules benefit them. There's limited transparency or accountability in the creation and enforcement of regulation. Little opportunity for the average citizen to combat industry-backed research, meetings, testimony that's too often vying against the public interest. And at the end of the day, allowing corporations and special interests to essentially capture our government with their massive and undue influence on federal agency. Mr. Michaels, as the former Assistant Secretary of Labor for OSHA, you've seen firsthand how companies thwart regulation through funding sham academic studies or powerful lobbying groups. What impact do these instruments of power have on the administrative process, and how does this impact workers? You need to turn your microphone on. Thank you.
Representative Jayapal, thank you for that question. It's a huge impact. The wealthy corporations and wealthy individuals know how to impact the system in so many ways. From the very beginning, where they have lawyers who are preparing documents, they hire scientists to produce studies. They know they have findings that will impact regulation. There's a revolving door, and so they hire very senior administrative officials who then can help them get through regulation. And the most sort of lurid example, which I think everybody's aware of, is that Purdue Pharmaceuticals hired the FDA regulator, essentially, who looked at the opioids that they were producing to then work with them to make sure they could sell more opioids, really leading to this disastrous opioid epidemic. The public doesn't have an equal say in this. I mean, that's exactly the problem. And the agencies are outgunned, as you heard from Professor Wagner, that knowing that they will end up in court, regulators often sort of pull back, or they negotiate with themselves even to protect the agency and to get something through. The result is that our regulations are weaker, they're not protective, and people are paying the price through illness, through death, and through a destroyed environment.
Thank you, Professor. Ms. Patterson, you're an expert in environmental and climate justice, and you've seen how the rulemaking process falls short in considering social equity in environmental regulation. Congress has required agencies to consider a host of industry-friendly economic factors when making rules, but it hasn't done the same for elements like equity and justice. How can Congress address that oversight?
Thank you. So one example is to make sure that we actually do have those avenues for public engagement in this conversation. So as I talked about the Office of Public Participation, and then also really building the capacity of agencies to be able to, and through that, in building the capacity of agencies to be able to engage directly with communities. And so communities and public interest groups know the types of mechanisms that we need to have to ensure that we're delivering equity. And they need to be able to be at the table with equal status to be able to put those ideas forward.
Very important, thank you. Professor Wagner, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs is responsible for reviewing proposed regulation by agencies, but it's often criticized for having too much control. OIRA instructs agencies to make substantial changes to rules, sometimes delaying the implementation of a regulation altogether. How does Congress work to make OIRA more efficient?
Thank you for that question. Actually, your bill, I think, does an excellent job on that front. First, it suggests that OIRA can't even be involved with an agency rule until the agency checks that rule into OIRA. Right now, OIRA works upstream before the review process. And secondly, your bill requires much more transparency on the nature of the changes. I think it would be even more helpful to know why the changes were made, maybe even put some prohibitions on changes to the scientific record, especially scientific records that have prior been peer-reviewed by expert panels before they hit OIRA. So it could go even further, but I think putting some transparency protections in place that are enforceable would go a long way.
Thank you so much. As legislators, it's our responsibility to restore the public's faith in our government, and my bill vastly improves that process. My time has expired. I yield back, and I now recognize the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes. Mr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Patterson, in Chairman Cicilline